All right. So we have looked at Ephesus, Pergamum, Smyrna, and Thyatira. And now we are looking on Sardis. And Sardis is the fifth of the seven churches that the letter in Revelation was addressed to. And this letter was written some 2,000 years ago. And at that point, the city had actually been around for about 700 years. And that just 700 years ago, 2,700 years ago, Sardis was at its peak. So we know that Sardis was located about 80 kilometers from Thyatira, and we know it was in modern Turkey. And Sardis had once been the richest and one of the most powerful cities in the complete known world. And at that time, there was no Protestant church in existence in Sardis. Sardis was unsurpassed as a commercial or a cultural center. It was situated at the junction of five main trading routes and was a major commercial center that overlooked the Hermus Valley. Okay. Now, Sardis was a rich city, really hadn't had much to do to achieve prosperity, but it was because of this sense of ease and apathy that eventually led to the very downfall of Sardis. You see, as we saw it in that video, the city was located at the top of a hill that was so steep that its defenses seemed you couldn't uh, overcome this city. And twice in the year 549 BC, and again 300 years later, its enemy scaled those steep cliffs, showed these cliffs, and discovered that the Sardinians were so confident they hadn't even posted a guard to protect their city. It's interesting to on how the first conqueror, the Cyrus of Persia, assured that there would be no rebellion in the city. So they wanted peace in that city, and no one in the city, and trying to keep peace. I found this really interesting because no one in the city was allowed to possess a weapon, and believe it or not, people were prohibited from wearing sandals. Well, why would they? Did they have to go barefoot? No, they had to wear these soft, like slippers type things as their footwear, and that was what the calmness and quietness of that city was like in those days. And then he ordered that the boys of Sardis they should be instructed in music and song and dance. And so as a result of all of this going on, it seems that the city had lost its spirit. And so in the year 17 AD, an earthquake did major damage all throughout the city. And the city was rebuilt primarily through the generosity of the emperor Tiberius. And some of us remember hearing about Tiberius. Well, the city was actually known for two things. Firstly, we're told that it was in Sardis that the process of dyeing wool was first discovered. Okay. And secondly, Sardis was known for its worship of the goddess Artemis. Now, you might recall that the worship of this Greek god Artemis sometimes was accompanied by immorality. Okay, so they didn't do a good job of their worshiping as we try to do of worshiping our Father in heaven. So there was no indication that there was any kind of persecution of the church at all in Sardis. And by the time John had written this letter, the city was wealthy, it was soft and degenerate, but it would appear that the church was much like that as well. See, there was no evidence to suspect that there was either heresy or persecution within their congregation. Excuse me. No, there was no threat inside or outside of the church. No one pardon me. I have to get a drink here. One commentator commented that the reason that the church in Sardis was left alone was this lack of aggressive and positive Christianity. In other words, they were content with the mediocrity, lacking both the enthusiasm to entertain a heresies, no, the depths of conviction which provokes intolerance. It was too harmless to be worthy of persecution. Harmless. That word, it made me think of something when I was in high school. I remember one time I was taking a gal out for an evening. Okay, a girl, one of my high school friends, and she said that normally she told me she was supposed to be home by 10 o'clock at night, but her father had said that since she was going out with me, it was okay for her to stay out till after midnight. Well, I found that a little bit interesting, and I asked her. I said, "Well, why is that? Does he trust me?" And she said, "No, no. The reason he said that was because he thinks that you're harmless." So I was harmless to the girls of my day. But there was no persecution of the church in Sardis because the church was considered harmless. And so, sheltered and unthreatened, the Sardis church gradually wilted until there was no substance to it at all. And Jesus said, and we heard this in the scripture, you have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. See, prophetically, we're told that the Sardis church represented a period of time between the years 1500 and 1700 AD. And those of you who know your church history are aware that in 1517, that was the year when a 30-year-old monk by the name of Martin Luther challenged the Roman Catholic Church. And that began what we know now as the Reformation. And the beginning of the Sardis era in church history coincides with the birth of the Protestant church. So how did this scripture relate 20 centuries ago? I mean, what does it have to say to you and I in the year 2025? Well, it begins with what I think is a scary revelation by Jesus when he said, I know all the things you do. Or in this case, maybe all the things you don't do. You see, the local church, the local body of Jesus will be examined to see what it had accomplished while on this earth and what had it done. So what we do, why we do it, and how we do it is all taken consideration by Jesus Christ. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells of the shepherd who separates the goats from the sheep. What was the criteria used for this division? We read, well, for I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me. And then in verses 42 and 43, in that same speech, it's repeated again. However, this time, there's no discussion about they had no food, no drinks, no visits, no hospitality. You see, it's assumed that because both groups address Jesus as Lord, that there would be equal representations, equal expectations. But I'm sure that one of the condemned, maybe when they heard this, maybe they stood up and they said, well, wait a minute. I mean, what about what we read about in Ephesians chapter 2, where it says, God saved you by his special favor when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done. So none of us can boast about that. See, what if they failed to realize is that the change that Christ makes in our hearts, you and I, will manifest itself ultimately as an expression of love that's most often identified with good works. Now, these good works, the good works won't save you. You will never be good enough or do enough or even give enough to get you into heaven. No. See, the mystery of salvation, that things which save you are namely grace and faith. And ultimately, that's what will produce the things that will save you, namely works and service. So, on the basis of that one statement, which precedes each of the 7 letters, when Jesus said, I know what you do, you need to ask yourselves as a church, well, what is it that we do? I mean, if Jesus was to write a letter to Pastor Dave of the Bramalea Free Methodist Church and begin his letter with the words, I know what you do, what would Jesus identify as the positive qualities or the negative qualities within our congregation? I mean, could we, as a body of believers, be judged on the merits of our own works if we had to be? I mean, have we given food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, clothes to the naked? Have we sheltered the homeless? Have we visited those who were sick or in prison? And if not, then I wonder if we will all end up with the sheep or the goats. You see, Jesus went on to say, I know all the things you do, and that you have a reputation for being alive. So today, in 2025, if we asked you what churches are alive, what would your response be? Well, the truth is if you were asked that question, you would probably have thought of, well, maybe some of the evangelical churches, maybe the more charismatic churches. And maybe within the evangelical community, you're thinking, yeah, the Free Methodist Church has a reputation for being alive. But the church in Sardis had a heritage behind them. They had a, hang on, something's happening to my computer. Sorry. Something popped up on my screen there. The church in Sardis had a heritage behind them that they had been a powerful witness in their community, and as such, they'd acquired the reputation for being alive. The churches of Reformation had made a clean break within the Church of Rome and had a name of being alive. And yet, the truth of the matter is that no matter how great our reputation is, no matter how wonderful our name is, as a Free Methodist church, each individual church has a responsibility to prove itself. And so here's something that's so profound that we need to write it down is if you're going to stay alive, you got to stay alive. Because every day there are people who arrive at funeral homes all over the city and people who have a reputation of being alive. But that doesn't help them now because now they're dead. And dead is dead. So Jesus went on to say pretty much the same thing when he said, I know all the things you do and that you have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. Well, we all know that after the but comes the truth. Shakespeare once wrote, but me no buts. Now, I have no idea what that means, but I always like to use quotes, famous quotes in my messages. And so after the but comes the truth. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. That's gotta hurt. Have you ever noticed the sign at a gas station when you're filling up and the sign says, in case of a discrepancy between this register and the one inside, the one at the pump will be considered accurate. Well, Jesus is saying, in case of a discrepancy between reputation and reality, reality will be considered correct. Last year's reputation is worthless, but if it doesn't measure up to today's reality, well, Robert Schumann said, there are two things very difficult in the world. One is to make a name for oneself, and the other is to keep it. So the Church of Sardis had an excellent name at one time, a name from being alive. But then Jesus said, I know better. I know that you are dead, not sick, not injured, not crippled, not faint, but weak. Not weak, but dead. And dead is dead. So what is dead? Well, when we talk about a dead church, what do we mean? What's dead to you may not be dead to the next person. And while we may define such and such as a church that's dead as being slow and dreary, there might be some people who would look at Bramalea Free Methodist Church and say, well, we found that be a little bit slow and dreary too. But that's not the measure that Jesus uses. In Collins Dictionary defines dead as this: no longer living, without life, death-like, lacking vitality, interest, warmth, without feeling, motion, or power, extinguished or extinct. So, what makes a church dead? Well, there are three characteristics that, in my mind, signifies that a person is dead. And if these characteristics are present in a person or in a church, then it probably indicates death. First, if you're dead, you lack compassion. There are no feelings in a dead person. No joy, no sorrow, no happiness, no anger, no nothing. We could say that a dead person is apathetic. Maybe we may at times we feel blue, we feel depressed. And maybe we have times where we'll say, well, I don't care about everything or anything. The dead person, on the other hand, well, just doesn't care. The dead church doesn't care. They don't care about someone's physical wellness. There's no compassion in the church. It goes back to what Christ said about those being hungry and thirsty and naked and sick, and nobody cared. That's the indicative of death. And yet, Jesus' brother James talked about the same thing in James chapter 2. Suppose you have a brother or a sister who needs food or clothing, and you say, well, goodbye, and God bless you, stay warm and eat well. But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, it isn't just enough to have faith. Faith doesn't show itself by good deeds. No, faith that doesn't show itself by good deeds is no faith at all. It's dead and it's useless. A church that is dead doesn't care. It doesn't care about people's physical needs, and it doesn't care about people's spiritual needs. When a church is dead, there's no interest in outreach or evangelism. There are all kinds of reasons why not, but the bottom line is that they just don't care. And if you're dead, then you lack warmth. A church might be a little bit cool, but that's just the personality of a church. Not every church is into hugging and gushing and that sort of thing, although I kind of like when we do hugging. But when there's no warmth or love at all, then the church is dead. When people visit our church, do they find it to be warm and welcoming? I don't mean temperature-wise. Do we make people feel welcome and cared for? I've actually visited before when I was in B churches. Kathy and I had visited churches where no one even spoke to us. We had gone in and found a place to sit in a pew and sit and listen, but no one talked to us. Oftentimes, I felt like we were intruders. It wasn't being a little cool, it was being cold. And if you're dead, then you lack movement. Do you ever notice about dead people? They don't move. Now, sometimes when you're going to visit, attend visitation at a funeral home, you might hear somebody say, referring to the dead person, "Oh, they look so lifelike." Well, no, they don't, because they're not moving. Dead people don't move, and dead churches do not move. Oh, yeah, they offer a lot of excuses about why they don't move. They might say things like, "Well, we've never done this that way," or "We're just a traditional church," or we tried that one way, but it didn't work," or "Why bother changing?" Or, "Well, the problem is the last pastor didn't do it that way, so why should we?" See, the truth of the matter is that if you aren't moving ahead, if you're not growing, then something is wrong. Something is wrong somewhere. What worked 100 years ago or even 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, or even last year won't necessarily work this year. Businesses that refuse to change, to update, to modernize, they eventually fail. And churches that refuse to change and update and modernize, they eventually die. Don't misunderstand me. I don't mean we change the message. The message, the word of God, is timeless. And that applies equally today as it did when it was first written. But the way we deliver it, sometimes it needs to change. If we're going to reach today's generation, that's what needs to happen. And when people are dead, I mean really, really dead, well, that usually stays that way. And the same, unfortunately, is the same for churches. But it doesn't have to be that way. Jesus tells the church in Sardis to do three things. Wake up. One of the first things that Jesus was telling the church was to look around where they were. In most of the 12-step programs that exist today, the first step is always the same. Wake up and admit that you have a problem. The first step for the dying church is to wake up and admit that things need to change. I'm pretty sure that up to this point, most of the people in the Sardis church would have thought that everything was going just fine. After all, there was no persecution operating, no heresies that we had a problem with. But Jesus was saying, wake up, look around and see how far you've fallen. Strengthen what little remains. And obviously the church wasn't a complete loss. We don't know what remained, but Jesus was basically telling them to build on their strengths. There may not have been much, but there was obviously something worth hanging on. And Jesus was telling them Jesus wasn't telling them that everything had to go. And in our spiritual lives, the spiritual life of Bramley Free Methodist Church, we need to sometimes go back to the basics and focus on the things that we do well. And then it leads us to go back to what you first heard and what you first believed. Jesus was saying, go back to where you started. He told the church in Ephesus to return to their first love. Remember when things were new and fresh and exciting? How your faith was when you first became a Christian? How exciting things were when the church was still young. We say you can't go back, but sometimes you have to do that before you can go ahead. So where are you today? Where are we as a church today? If Jesus was to look down at Bramley Free Methodist Church and write a letter to us, what would he be telling us as individuals and as a church? Let's reflect on that. Amen.